One of the best ways for a country to raise revenue is to export commodities on the international market. In the case of countries like Japan or China, it could be exporting manufactured products. With countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia, it could be exporting a natural resource like oil. It's just a simple fact of an interconnected and globalized economy. Now, this fact is especially important to note if you're a third world dictator, isolated on the international stage, and in desperate need of raising money. At that point, you really need to start getting creative. Sure, you can export normal stuff like lumber or coal, but especially if you're sanctioned and in dire economic straits, you might need something a bit more lucrative. This is where we get to one of the most valuable commodities of all, the Jewish people. Yes, you heard that correctly. Jewish people. The followers of Judaism. Now, this obviously sounds a bit insane. How can a country make money exporting Jews? Well, not only has this happened once, it's actually happened multiple times. This is going to be the bizarre story of the State of Israel and its attempts to purchase Jews from around the world in order to bolster its own population. It's an incredibly strange story, so let's start from the beginning. In 1948, the unfortunate State of Israel was created, being founded on the dispossession and displacement of the Palestinians. The newly formed Jewish state had an obvious problem though. They were surrounded on all sides by much larger Arab states that outnumbered them tenfold. The Israelis were simply at a population and demographic disadvantage. Of course, there are ways to mitigate this, such as acquiring superior military armaments, building relationships with the West, and forming backdoor deals with treacherous Arab states. But at the end of the day, being outnumbered is being outnumbered. While Israel would obviously never be able to get close to the regional Arab population, they still wanted to bolster their numbers however possible. One of the main ways being attracting Jewish migration from around the world. This is a long-standing policy of Israel. If you're a Jew living anywhere in the world, be it Poland or Morocco, you can come to Israel and get citizenship. This is something Ben Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, explicitly mentioned in a letter to his son. So given the situation, Israel was very desperate to increase its population. There's a lot of things Israel did in an attempt to increase Jewish migration, including alleged false flag attacks in the Arab world against Mizrahi Jews to entice them to leave. It also includes trying to outright barter with states to acquire their Jewish population. In this video, I'll be going over 3 specific cases, starting with Ethiopia and the exodus of the Ethiopian Jews. Ethiopia is a fairly complicated country. It has a lot of different ethnicities and a lot of languages, and is overall just extremely diverse. A lot of people might not know that Ethiopia has actually had a significant Jewish population. In fact, it was one of the oldest in the world. The Ethiopian Jews have had a complex relationship with the State of Israel, often subjugated to racism and discrimination throughout time. In fact, there was a period when they were hardly even accepted in Israel. A chief rabbi of Israel once remarked, "Who needs those blacks?" But despite the societal racism, they became more accepted over time. At the end of the day, an Ethiopian Jew can still be a soldier and still uphold the colonial project. The Israelis figured that petty bigotry shouldn't be a barrier to a wholesome, multicultural apartheid state. Since at least the 1960s, Israel and Ethiopia have had a fairly warm relationship. Israel had a clear interest in the Horn of Africa, and was a key military partner of the Ethiopian state, giving them both aid and training. Ethiopia, as a non-Muslim country in the region that was in conflict with both Egypt and Somalia, was just a natural partner. They had mutual opponents, so it made sense to work together. Ethiopia had a large Jewish population, and Israel wanted the Jews. You can imagine that the outcome would be simple from there. Well, not so fast, because the actual details and logistics of such a plan had not yet materialized. And there were geopolitical realities on the ground that had to be addressed. Israel wanted to airlift the Ethiopian Jews to Israel, and part of this had to wait for Sudan, the country directly bordering Ethiopia. Sudan was an Arab country that was nominally at war with Israel, and didn't always have the best relationship with Ethiopia either. So naturally, they weren't exactly keen on helping Ethiopia with a population transfer. But eventually, the circumstance would change, and the situation would become far more suitable for the Israelis. In 1969, a coup d'etat put President Jafar Numeri in charge of Sudan. He was far more pragmatic on this issue, and had his own reasons to benefit from such a dealing. Thus, room for a backdoor deal between Ethiopia, Israel, and Sudan became possible. A transfer deal was partially negotiated by Saudi businessmen Adnan Khashoggi. Unequivocally, the Sudanese regime under the leadership of President Numeri was pivotal among them, providing the territorial base for launching the mission. The Israeli cooperation with Numeri had been developed from the late 1970s onwards with the significant help of the Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi. The dominant influence of the United States convinced Numeri to allow the airlift operations to take place, while also serving as a mediatory platform for clandestine diplomacy and as a facilitator for overseeing various practical aspects of the whole affair. You might be reading this and ask, is that Adnan Khashoggi related to Jamal Khashoggi, that famous Saudi dissident who got extrajudicially killed in Turkey and chopped up with a bone saw by the Saudi state? Well, yes, they are related. The Khashoggi family is an interesting bunch, and they have their own complicated history within Saudi. But that's a story for another day.
Sudan was on board and willing to help. Transfer negotiations would continue, and many operations would be planned. One of the largest operations happened in the 1980s, titled Operation Moses. On the 23rd of March 1985, the airlift affair made media headlines again when information came out that a new evacuation of 800 Ethiopian Jews from their temporary camps in Sudan had been completed, this time on American planes. This was a CIA-sponsored follow-up mission to Operation Moses, named Operation Joshua by the United States, but known in Israel as the Sheba Operation. Even now, however, Khartoum claimed total ignorance of this operation, stating that it had not been, and never would be, a party to such an action.
There was motivation for Sudan to be involved in this, primarily getting US support, especially after the 1976 coup attempt in which the Sudanese government blamed the USSR. Sudan had an extremely anti-communist bent, so associating with the USA was a natural plan. Though, this agreement did have to be kept secret because such a dealing between an Arab state and Israel would be entirely scandalous. Ethiopia also naturally benefited from this deal, specifically in getting American and Israeli military support to help in their existing conflicts against Somalia and Eritrea. Some Western observers believe that Israel provided military assistance to Ethiopia in exchange for Mengitsu's tacit cooperation during Operation Moses in 1984, in which 10,000 Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, also called Falasha, were evacuated to Israel. In 1985, Tel Aviv reportedly sold Addis Ababa at least 20 million in Soviet-made munitions and spare parts captured from Palestinians in Lebanon. According to the EPLF, the Mengitsu regime received $83 million worth of Israeli military aid in 1987, and Israel deployed some 300 military advisors to Ethiopia. Additionally, the EPLF claimed that 38 Ethiopian pilots had gone to Israel for training. This aid would prove to be extremely beneficial for Ethiopia as the premier state in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia, being a Christian nation, also did not have the same concern around appeasing Muslim discontent in the way Sudan or Sadat's Egypt did. Overall, it was a beneficial relation that would be continued. This wouldn't be the last Jew transfer either. Another airlift was negotiated in 1991, and this was also done for financial and military support. The massive 150 million airlift, dubbed Operation Solomon, at one point, had 28 planes in the air at a single time. Israeli officials revealed that the talks leading up to the airlift involved repeated requests by the Ethiopian government for arms supplies, including a secret trip by Mengitsu to Israel last June. Israeli television said that the reports that the Ethiopian regime had received a last-minute payment of 35 million before the airlift was allowed to commence. This operation airlifted 14,325 Ethiopian Jews to Israel within 36 hours. Given that Ethiopia was compensated roughly 35 million, doing some quick arithmetic, that means Ethiopia was paid about 2,443 per Jew. Ethiopia and Israel maintained fairly good relations even today. They've maintained extensive military relations and have many political ties. As recently as 2020, there's been continued discussion about airlifting the last remaining Jews in Ethiopia to Israel. Now, this whole situation is very bizarre. It was literally a country exchanging Jewish citizens for aid and weapons. But you may be surprised to hear it's far from the only case. The next example will be one perhaps even more unlikely, involving the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, this case might be shocking. Iran is a sworn enemy of Israel. They are a supporter of anti-Zionist resistance groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah. Clearly, these two states have no love for each other, so how could any of this possibly happen? Well, it's a bit complicated. Iran has historically had one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. On the eve of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, 80,000 Jews lived in Iran. Nowadays, upwards of 200,000 Persian Jews live in Israel. It is one of their largest demographics. So, a question we should ask is, how did all of these Jews get from Iran to Israel, specifically after the 1979 Islamic Revolution under the government of Ayatollah Khomeini? How and why did this population transfer occur, especially given such an outwardly hostile stance from Iran against Israel? The main impetus begins in 1980 with the Iran-Iraq War. Now, this war is pretty complicated and could be pretty long to explain, and is deserving of a video of its own. But suffice to say, as the name suggests, it was an 8-year-long war between the Islamic Republic of Iran against Ba'athist Iraq led by Saddam Hussein. This was one of the largest and most brutal land wars since World War II, with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Iran in particular was in desperate need of modern weaponry and spare parts. And in what may be a surprise, Israel was willing to help. There's a lot of reasons for this, but the main factor being that Israel saw the Arab states, and especially Iraq, as their biggest and most immediate enemies. Therefore, anything that could weaken Iraq would be the priority. Another aspect was that Iran under the Shah already had a very good pre-existing relationship with Israel that naturally they would want to try and continue. So, covert weapon shipments between Israel and Iran would occur, and this would later become mixed into the infamous Iran-Contra affair. You can read more about this in The Dark Alliance by Truda Parsi. Now, to get to the important part, the Iranian Jews became important to Israel because they wanted to increase their Jewish population as a wedge against the Arabs. Israel seeking more ways to cooperate with Iran on various issues, including the war with Iraq. A declassified CIA document from 1985 says as much. According to the US Embassy, Israel was also interested in assisting Iran in its support of Kurdish separatists in Iraq, hoping to strengthen the rebels to distract the Iraqi government from anti-Israel activities. Iran, in turn, may have provided Mossad with intelligence concerning Iraqi order of battle. In addition, Israel was concerned about the welfare of the 90,000 Jews who lived in Iran, and hoping that its developing relations with the Shah would give it leverage to apply on the Jews' behalf if the need arose. Iran needed the weapons, and Israel wanted the Jews. It's not hard to figure out what would happen next. According to a Washington Post article from 1987, this motivation from the Israeli side was clear. Israeli officials here confirm Mock's basic information about the exodus of Iranian Jews. The fate of Jews in Iran has been an important consideration in Israeli policy toward that country, and Israel has acknowledged selling arms to Iran. To go into more detail, Jack Straw, a former British ambassador to Iran, actually talked about this exact arrangement in an interview with Arab media. He discussed how the passage of Iranian Jews to Israel was a big part of this loose alliance against Iraq.
بين أعوام 1980 و 1988 كانت إسرائيل هي الموردة والمزودة الغربية الوحيدة والموثوق لأسلحة إيران. في عام 1982 كان دينيس هيلي وزير خارجية حكومة الظل العمالية في بريطانيا يشكو داخل مجلس العموم من أن أرييل شارون وزير الدفاع الإسرائيلي أبلغه أن دولته تجهز إيران بالأسلحة. الإسرائيليون منحوا إيران معلومات عن مواقع عسكرية غربي العراق قبل أن تقوم طائرات إيرانية بالمهمة. ثم فيما يتعلق بالمفاعل النووي في العراق، فقد زودت إيران إسرائيل بالكثير من الصور الجوية. كان الأمر أقرب إلى كونه تعاونا إيرانيا إسرائيليا عسكريا. وثمة جزء آخر للصفقة، وهو وجود عدد مهم من اليهود في إيران. والإسرائيليون كانوا يريدون ضمان انتقال من يرغب الانتقال لإسرائيل بسلام. لذلك فإن آية الله خامنئي وافق في مقابل الحصول على السلاح الإسرائيلي على سفر أي يهودي إيراني إلى إسرائيل. ومن بين نحو 75,000 يهودي إيراني في الثمانينيات، نحو 50,000 منهم انتقلوا للعيش في إسرائيل. وطبعا هذا الموضوع منح إسرائيل عددا كبيرا من الإيرانيين المتحدثين بالفارسية.
This arrangement obviously had to be kept quiet. It would be an embarrassment for both countries and undermine the mutual rhetoric of animosity, so receiving these weapons wasn't exactly a part of the script.
Where do you get the arms from?
از کجا شما این اسلحه ها رو به دست میارید؟
نمیدونم.
I don't know.
To get into the details themselves, throughout the entirety of the war, Israel sold Iran roughly $2 billion worth of weaponry, a lot of which was mediated through the United States. This was undoubtedly a pretty important source of supplies for Iran, given that they were in a difficult situation in the Iran-Iraq War and suffered from international sanctions and isolation that had been imposed upon them after 1979. A lot of this goes into details of the Iran-Iraq War, which again is a fairly complicated topic that I can't do justice in this video. So, suffice to say, even if according to Iran, Israel may be the little Satan, sometimes you have to make a deal with the devil, and in this case Iran did.
So, with everything said, we can move on to the final, and maybe even strangest case, being communist Romania. While nominally socialist, it was not fully dependent on the USSR like most of the Eastern Bloc, and was far more willing to chart an independent path. It was also led by this really weird guy named Nicholas Ceausescu. This guy was pretty wacky and also had a famous quote about cocaine, but we'll get more into that later. But regardless, that's not important. To get to the point, Romania was a fairly poor country, their economy was not very robust, and they had a lot of economic issues, but they did have a very large Jewish population. And in a post-World War II environment with Israel being newly created, I'm sure you can imagine what transpired next. In 1948, the State of Israel was founded, and it had a fairly strong relation to most of the socialist bloc. It was recognized by the USSR, and in their very first war against the Arabs, they received covert arms shipments from Czechoslovakia. Later on, much of the socialist bloc became more hostile toward Israel, but there was always some more willing to look the other way, and this was always true for Romania. As Ben Gurion once remarked in his journal, you can't do anything without money. From top to bottom, even the Communist Party wants money. Capital really does rule the world, who would have imagined? To speak of one of the first deals, it involved charging a simple fee for each Jew who sought to immigrate to Israel from Romania. In the fall of 1949, according to an agreement between the Israeli legation in Bucharest and Sovom Transport, a Romanian-Russian transport service largely under Russian control, the legation was obliged to pay $57 for every third-class ticket on a ship bound from Romania to Israel. This was one of the earliest schemes, and it was incredibly simple. Romanian officials would simply look the other way on Romanian migration as long as they could jack up the cost and make a good profit. The Romanian officials were somewhat cautious though, and only let a limited amount leave at first. According to a 1951 government report, Romania had come to depend on this important source of hard currency. It is difficult for the Romanian state, at this point, to renounce a yearly income in hard currency of about $2 million. This arrangement was a decent amount of money already, but the deals going forward would become even more strange. A lot of people might not know this, but Romania did actually have a sizable amount of oil, something that was extremely important during both world wars. Oil is obviously a very valuable commodity, so Romania would obviously want to capitalize on this if possible. The only issue being that drilling oil can often be quite complicated and expensive depending on the situation. Due to disagreements with the USSR and existing isolation from the West, Romania had limited options and they needed partners. Israel, of course, was happy to oblige. Ibrahim Ilin, a major Israeli business tycoon, who was also coincidentally involved in Czech's arms smuggling, was a leading force of this negotiation. The instruments and the drill pipes were at that time more important to the Romanians than a few more Jews. The agreement signed between Ibrahim Ilin and the Romanians dealt with the whole shipload of drilling equipment. Even though no mention was made of a quid pro quo, the agreement between me and the Romanians spoke about exit permits for many thousands of Jews still in Romania. The figure was astronomical, about 20% of all the Jews still in Romania, but the Romanians gladly agreed. The scale of this population transfer was truly enormous. Romania had a fairly sizable Jewish population, and thousands upon thousands of them would end up leaving to Israel, partly in exchange for oil equipment and money. These events were so shameful that the Israeli Knesset made an offense to speak of such events. I guess even the Israelis themselves are sometimes capable of feeling shame. But of course, even this deal was not the end, and if anything, just the beginning. Around this time, we would see more American involvement with Romania, especially regarding Israeli relations. Romania wanted to be able to open trade relations with the West, but America was not particularly enthusiastic about this. In an attempt to appease the West, Romania began to loosen immigration for Jews, and many thousand began to leave to Israel. Romania would then enter a balancing act of simultaneously trying to send more Jews to Israel, while also seeming friendly to the Arab world at large. According to Lebochi Lice, Arab ambassadors threatened to leave Bucharest. And when an office of the Karen Hayesod, the equivalent of America's United Jewish Appeal, campaign was opened in Israel, Ben-Gurion denounced Romania for bowing to Arab pressure. Ben-Gurion's condemnation generated a fierce response from the newspaper of the Romanian Communist Party. On February 25, 1949, Sentia devoted its front page to an attack on Zionism. This is an example of how the ideological stances of communist Romania would shift on a dime. If Zionism was useful, they were a great friend of Israel. If it became troublesome, then they were an enemy of Zionism and a great friend of the Arabs. It was always based on what was most convenient at the time. Now, despite the backlash, it was still overall a beneficial move for Romania. They were able to get a good amount of economic benefit. As their political and economic relations with the USSR proved fruitless, Romanian authorities desperately sought favorable trade relations with the West. In mid-April 1959, Romania notified Washington that it was willing to discuss war damages and the nationalization of US interests. Within 2 months, Romania had secured $60 million in contracts with various Western companies. Being able to open up these trade relations with the West was immensely beneficial for Romania. It helped them to drastically increase their income from exports by roughly $300 million per year. This deal with America also pushed the USSR to be more proactive with Romania. Thus, Romania was able to play a balancing act, similar to Yugoslavia, and potentially benefit from both sides. Romania had a lot to gain by working with Israel, so they continued to try and get as many deals as possible. One of the stranger deals came when Romanian officials negotiated for many Jewish families to leave for Israel if in exchange they got an automated chicken farm. Although Bucharest at first rejected the proposal, considering it a provocation, Jacob persisted. Several months later, he proposed to build an automated chicken farm in Romania, free of charge, if 500 Jewish families were allowed to leave. I'm not even exactly sure what an automated chicken farm exactly is, but I'm sure they thought it was worth it. All of this is pretty crazy, and there's even some stuff I forgot to mention. Like that time Romania was literally trading Jews for pigs. So suffice to say, it was a pretty big business. In fact, it was so lucrative they tried to do the same scheme with other populations residing in Romania, such as the German ethnic minority, which also had varied success. Romania sold not only its Jews. Encouraged by the results in the Jewish trade, Ceausescu ordered the Dai to initiate a similar operation for ethnic Germans, which he considered potentially even more lucrative. Pakepa writes, there were at that time more ethnic Germans than Jews left in Romania. This might as well be a scene out of Better Call Saul. you are trying to desperately sell and barter out all of your ethnic minorities just to make some extra cash. All 3 cases mentioned in this video are pretty crazy, but this one is definitely the most insane. Just pure hustling with full disregard for anything else. It didn't matter if you were trading Jews for chicken farms, weapons, or money. In each case, it was all about making a deal. Now, with everything said, I think there's still an important conclusion to draw. Because despite how comical and goofy all of these situations seem, something important is being underlined. Ultimately, we should understand that the extent that Israel would go to increase its Jewish population speaks very deeply about its priorities both as a project and as a nation. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but the quote-unquote demographic threat of the Palestinian population has always loomed over Israel. It's why they constantly want to increase their Jewish population as much as possible. We see this in its most ugly form with the Zionist Judaization programs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and its extermination campaign in Gaza, but we also see this in more subtle ways, like the Birthright program, which is designed to entice Jews from around the world to migrate and live in Israel. That's why it's so important to speak about these things at appropriate terms. If you are a Jew outside of Israel, and you willingly decide to make Aliyah and immigrate to Israel, you are just as much a willing perpetrator of Palestinian genocide and erasure as much as any IDF soldier or Likud member. As a final comment, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to be able to make more content in the future. Please let me know what you thought in the comments below.